All right. Hello, everyone. So the study that I ran looked into the mediating role of need frustration, specifically as a potential link between COVID-19 distress and psychopathology in college students. And the reason that I wanted to tackle this type of study is because it was something that obviously we've all lived through. It's something that was all around us for the last year. It's still kind of around us. And when I see something that is affecting my friends, my family, my peers, my teammates, I really wanted to kind of jump in and kind of take control of the issue and investigate it. And so this is how I tackled it, specifically through the lens of self-determination theory in a mediation model. And like I said, I know we all went through this, we all lived it, but I think it is important to look back in hindsight and kind of, take into consideration, the drastic path that this pandemic took, specifically in the early months. And so just to recap really what I'm sure we all kind of are aware of, the first reported case of COVID was found in late December of 2019 in Wuhan, China. And over the next few months until March 13th, 154 countries across the globe reported a positive case of COVID-19. And then the US sees an exponential rise, an almost exponential rise, from around 4,000 cases on March 16th to over 200,000 only 2 weeks later. And so this really, really speaks to the kind of trauma and the kind of the new experiences we all were having in terms of this pandemic, and the potential effects that this exponential rise could have on different demographics of people. And specifically, we're going to be looking at university students. And if we look at that, we can see that over 1,100 universities closed down by April 1st. And 14 million students in those universities were affected. And then we have the summer, we have the quarantine period last year. And then eventually, as fall starts to come around in August of last year, the university and lots of universities like the University of Rochester released this restart protocol. How are we going to get our students back on campus for quality of learning purposes, for financial purposes, to try and get back to normal in some sort of fashion. And when students return, they're faced with a whole bunch of stressors, acute stressors on campus. How do I stay healthy? How do I keep my friends healthy? How do I make sure that we can continue to do this? And then also distant stressors. How is my family doing? Are they healthy? Does my dad still have a job? Does my mom, is my mom still happy when she gets up in the morning? All these types of questions are on their minds. And so I thought it was important to kind of tackle the effects that this was having on our students. And the way I wanted to look at this specifically is through this measure of COVID distress. And I reached out to Dr. Stephen Taylor at the University of British Columbia, and he provided a lot of insight. He gave me permission to use this measure that he'd been developing. And he's dedicated his career to the psychology of pandemics. He talked through the SARS pandemic in the early 2000s. He's done research on H1N1 in the early teens. And he's really focused on how individuals' behavior, whether they are hypervigilant or whether they are hypovigilant, whether they are not really taking it seriously, and how individuals' behavior can translate to how we deal with the pandemics in general and how they progress. And so this measure of COVID distress is broken down into 5 categories, which you can see here, which is a fear of infection, fear of contamination, fear of socioeconomic consequences, and then compulsive checking and reassurance behaviors, such as constant internet searching about COVID symptoms, COVID treatments, things like that. And then traumatic stress indicators, sleep disturbances, nightmares, intrusive thoughts throughout the day about COVID and the pandemic. And so this is how we kind of operationalized COVID distress and how we measured it within the study. And how I wanted to approach the study was through the lens of self-determination theory, specifically the mini theory, which looks at basic psychological needs, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with. But just to break it down, the first psychological need is autonomy, which is this need to self-regulate and self-endorse one's actions and to feel volitional in one's choices, to feel like you have free choice. And then competence, which is the need to be effective in what you're doing, the need to feel a sort of level of mastery in your life with what's important to you. And then finally, relatedness, which speaks to this bidirectional need to provide care for others and to also feel cared for yourself. And when these things are supported, when these needs are supported within the environment, within the conditions present in the environment, it's more likely that the individual will be healthy, psychologically and physically. They'll be optimized in their functioning, in their work, and they'll generally be well. They'll have a high level of well-being. And then on the opposite side of things, when these needs are frustrated, when the environment is what we call need thwarting, you have these basic psychological needs which are not met. And for autonomy, this can look like controlling conditions or controlling language can restrict one's autonomy. For competence, this can be thwarted by unrealistic challenges or overbearing pressures in those challenges. And then relatedness can be thwarted as well, oftentimes through isolation or other significant roadblocks to meaningful relationships. And, you know, in taking all of that in, it's very plausible that these conditions in the current school year can lead to these potential need thwarting environments. And I think it was important to look at this closely. And so here I've kind of posited need satisfaction and need frustration on opposite sides of the spectrum, and what are some, studied, replicated outcomes of these variables. For need satisfaction, we see that individuals have higher levels of life satisfaction, higher levels of vitality. They feel energized in their life, and enhanced engagement with their tasks, with their work. And then on the other side of things, when individuals' needs are frustrated, you have outcomes like significant depression and anxiety symptoms, elevated stress levels, and somatic symptom burden, which can manifest in the form of physical pain. And for this particular study, we're going to look at need frustration and need frustration's role within this university climate. And so the model that this study is based on, the general model that this comes from, has been studied mainly within the last decade or so. And it speaks to this mediation model, that social emotional distress mediated by need frustration leads to negative psychological and physical health outcomes. And specifically within the realm of this study, we can focus on COVID-19 distress as this variable of social emotional distress. And this will be measured by the COVID distress measure from Dr. Stephen Taylor. And then through need frustration as the potential mediator, which will be measured by basic psychological need frustration and satisfaction scale, which has been replicated and used over the last several decades or so. And then our health outcomes will look at decreased wellness as well as increased ill-being. So both sides of the issue, the same issue. And we're gonna look at this through measures 3, 4, and 5, which we'll look at here. And so looking specifically at the demographics of our study, our participants, we had an N of 114, with 28 males responding. So the majority of respondents were female in this case. The mean age of our respondents was 19.8 years, with 43% of them being Caucasian, 32% being first-year students. So about a third of our respondents were new to college. This was their first experience of the university. And then about 58% of our respondents were living on campus throughout the fall semester. And then just to go through the measures that we used, COVID stress scales, getting at COVID distress, which I talked about earlier. Measure 2 is basic psychological need satisfaction and frustration. Measure 3, measure 4, measure 5, we have depression, anxiety, and the stress scale. Subjective vitality and somatic symptom severity scale, which is part of the patient health questionnaire. And these are all replicated subjective self-reports that have been used frequently in recent times. And the way we analyzed our results, we used a bootstrapped simple mediation model with 5,000 resamples, which is first brought about by Preacher and Hayes in 2004 and has been used in simple mediation since. And it gets at the individual mediation below. And so we looked at each negative health outcome in terms of the mediation. And so COVID-19 distress, for example, through mediated by need frustration, had an impact on stress. And looking at the results of our mediation, we see that starting with stress, the indirect effect was significant, meaning that the independent variable, COVID distress, affected the dependent variable, which was stress, general stress, through the mediator of need frustration. And this relationship was significant. In addition, 7.2% of the variance in stress was accounted for by this effect. Going on to depression, the indirect effect was again significant, with 6.6% of the variance in depression accounted for here. For anxiety, the indirect effect was also significant, with a number of 12% of variance accounted for in this case. Somatic symptom burden, the indirect effect between COVID-19 distress through need frustration to somatic symptom burden, was also significant, which is important because this shows a manifestation of physical symptoms from psychosomatic pain. And we see that 6.6% of variance in the somatic symptom burden was also accounted for. And then finally, the only indirect effect that we found to be insignificant was a relationship with vitality. And only 0.1% of variance in vitality was accounted for. And so in conclusion, most broadly, we see that need frustration does serve as an explanatory variable for the relationship between COVID-19 distress and global negative health outcomes. We also see that need frustration significantly mediates, as a partial mediator, the relationship between COVID-19 distress and these negative health outcomes: stress, depression, anxiety, and somatic symptom burden. And then finally, need frustration does not significantly mediate the relationship between COVID-19 distress and vitality, which is possibly because vitality is a positively valenced measure, the only positively valenced negative health outcome that we looked at. And so this may be a reason why we weren't able to find significance in this relationship. And within this study, we have 4 significant findings, significant correlations across the board, but it's very important to keep in mind some certain limitations of the study, given the relatively small sample size of 114 students within this particular demographic as well, of college students. And the way we kind of tried to limit the error of the small sample size is using this bootstrapping method, this replicated bootstrapping method, to introduce a sense of normality, a level of normality to the analysis. And then secondly, it's a cross-sectionally designed study. So we don't necessarily have the scope to look at changes in these relationships over time. Do students become acclimated to these environments over time? Do they improve? The conditions improve? Does need frustration lessen over time? Or do the effects exacerbate over time? And that's something that could be focused on in future study. And then thirdly, it's a strictly self-report study. But it's also important to keep in mind that the measures we used were highly replicated and validated. And they all get at subjective experiences. And so a self-report study with subjective experience as the focus mitigates this error, because we're looking purely at how our students are experiencing the pandemic and its effects, not necessarily an objectified measure. And then finally, just want to talk about the implications of our results. We found that this data supports the role of need frustration in mediating the relationship between situational distress, in this case, COVID distress, and global negative health outcomes. So this fits within the theory of social emotional distress through need frustration leading to negative health outcomes as a broad model in the recent literature. And then secondly, this highlights the importance of need supporting environments as students tackle the challenges ahead, throughout the remaining week or two of this semester, throughout the summer, but then also next year. It's very possible that students have become habituated and patterned in these behaviors of fear, of contamination, of anxieties, of different traumatic stress indicators like that. So it's important that we don't brush this under the carpet, that we continue over the next few years, however long it may be, however long our students may be struggling. And this leads into this third point, that it's very important that the school emphasizes their clinical resources and interventions, of which we have many, which is great. But it's very important that this is emphasized to students, specifically for the negative health outcomes we found: elevated stress, depression, anxiety, and somaticized pain. And then finally, this is something that came about in a conversation with Dr. Taylor. In this increasingly globalized world that we live in, which will only continue to become more globalized, it's very possible, and it's been predicted, that this won't be the last socially driven pandemic of this century. And I think it's very important to continue to try and understand how we may tackle this issue in the future, and how we may tackle the effects of it in the future, so that we may be better prepared, and better prepared specifically for our college students, because this is what this study is looking to tackle, and this is what this study is looking to provide information on. And I just want to say thank you to Chris for really helping me find my passion in psychology and cultivating it over the last year or so. And then also Lisa Starr for being very supportive, being my second reader, and being very supportive and understanding, especially the last few months or so. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Lisa. And thank you all for listening.